educator at High Tech High, the world-renowned project-based learning school. He understands the impact of agency on student learning. He currently resides in Hong Kong, where he spends time developing student-centered schools of the future. Audience, please note we have a brief Q&A session at the end of the workshop. However, this is an interactive workshop, so we will be coming to you and addressing your questions. And on that note, Mr. Kyle Wagner, over to you.
Hey everyone, it is nice to be here virtually, and we're trying something I think that most people probably assumed was never possible, right? I'm tuning in virtually. We're having an actual workshop in person, so of course, without the technology and this whole past 2 years of what's happened with virtual learning, I'm not sure something like this is possible. So I want to first thank the SOT conference for having me here. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. And I think the big question on our mind is, how do we make our environments more learner-centered? Because we've seen that Generation Z thinks a little bit differently than we do. If you had the pleasure of seeing this video that I started with, you noticed that the person who spoke, she's 12 years old, and the eloquence with which she speaks.
My name is Anaya Razan. I'm from class 7. I study at Beacon House Walnut Campus, and today, with the SOT, I had the rare opportunity to speak a few words about this generation. Now, if I had to give a few words on this generation, it would definitely be that we're expressive, outspoken, collaborative, independent, creative, and overall we just want to learn.
So our question, if we know that this generation is collaborative, independent, creative, outspoken, and expressive, how do we create the kind of environments that are going to be most conducive for these learners? I understand a lot of us are teachers and educators looking to individualize and personalize our instruction for students. Some of us don't have the same technology, right? I mean, that's the reality of this situation. We don't all have the same resources. We have all different learners with many different backgrounds and needs. Some have different learning styles. Some might have learning differences or learning difficulties and challenges. And how can we create the kind of environments that are conducive for bringing Generation Z out? And how can we move from a teacher-centered classroom where we are at the front and we're delivering instruction? How do we move that to be a learner-centered classroom? Because the fact is, there are potentially 25 to 30, some of us teach in classrooms that have over 30 students. There are 30 plus potential teachers in the classroom. It's our job to harness our students' energy and harness the brilliance and expertise of our students so that they can learn truly from each other, because they are outspoken, expressive, intelligent, creative, and they want to have the opportunity to share. So how do we do that? That's what this presentation is going to be about. What if I told you that there was a simple formula for putting your learners at the center of their experiences, and all it involved was 3 simple steps? And those 3 simple steps can be replicated over and over and over to create the kind of environments that allow learners to thrive. But before we get to those 3 steps, first step of this workshop is for you to envision, if you were to walk into a learner-centered classroom in action, what might you see? Okay, now before you discuss this, I want you to think. You might have actually had the opportunity to visit a campus. One of the first campuses that I visited was High Tech High when I was a young aspiring teacher back in my early 20s. And one of the things I noticed when I walked into a learner-centered classroom is it was very hard to find the teacher. So that might be one of the things you noticed. But I want you to work with the person next to you. I'm sure many of you are teachers or educators. Think in your mind, if you were to walk into a classroom that was run by the learners, what would you see? Okay, so Conwal, I think you're going to turn it over to them to discuss that, and we're going to take some answers.
So Kyle, I think a few members are ready to share. Should we start taking responses?
Excellent, let's hear them.
Okay, so we have a response, yes.
A classroom where the teacher's talk is minimum and the student's talk time is more.
Great, so higher student talk time than teacher time.
Sir, would you
Talk
like
time,
to
great.
Yeah, it's a while since I was at school, but it would seem to me such an initiative would need some very clearly established ground rules about the protocols of how it will be handled. Um, yeah, that's it sounds a bit scary as an idea, but it's a very good idea, but it needs the protocols.
Okay, so would you see certain protocols taking place in the classroom? Is that something you'd see to know that there are some structures?
Yes, absolutely. It would be somewhat chaotic, I think, unless that was established about the sort of rules of engagement.
Excellent. So certain rules of engagement, right? Students know that there's structures or protocols to guide them. Teacher talk is low, student talk is high. What else would we see?
Any more responses?
We would see students researching if it's a computer lab or working or discussing things together, and then teacher can facilitate them, so that will be a minimum talk, and students can do the main thinking and creating new ideas or whatever.
Great. So researching, discussing, you'd see that happening, right? It'd be fairly focused kind of talk with the teacher maybe circulating around. Let's get maybe one or two more, Kanwa.
We have
where teachers play a role of facilitators and students are active learners.
Great. And what does that look like when the teacher's playing the role of facilitator?
Sir, I would like to ask you, I would like to tell that we give opportunities to students to ask questions.
Okay. So it's driven by questions, right? And the teachers may be provoking some of those questions. All right, one more.
So anyone else who would like to share? Yes.
I would like to say here that following the cognitive load theory, we are actually not burdenizing the students to do a lot of things. The individual is doing a lot of things on his own. We have to divide the students, that someone is reading, someone is noting down the points, and someone is writing or someone is discussing. So that is how their minds are working in one direction at a time, and the collaborative learning is happening in the classroom, and in the end product is the product of the whole group, and everyone has put his input. Thank you.
Wonderful. And I like how you mentioned, students are aware of different roles that they might have. Someone might be, recording down thoughts if it's a discussion. Someone might be sharing those thoughts. So if we have a classroom where students have different roles, we have a classroom where they're understanding the protocols, we have a classroom where inquiry is driving a lot of the teaching and learning, we have a classroom where the teacher is facilitating discussion, we have a classroom that has very, very low teacher talk and high student talk. Well, what in the world might that look like, and how do we create that? Because that's what this presentation is going to be about. Because I think, someone mentioned most of the work should be done by the students. A little preparation work is necessary, of course, by the teacher. But one of my favorite quotes, and it was from High Tech High, is that simple structures are going to beget complex results. And if we can have a simple structure for teaching and learning and something that engages students, then that simple structure and a little bit of some guidance along the way, as our first gentleman mentioned, so it's not chaotic, that will then create this kind of environment. So I'm just going to show you a picture of maybe what you have just discussed, okay? You notice, students seem to have different roles. And think about what you're seeing here, right? You see students, they're grouped together at different tables. You have, this gentleman, this group of boys right here, there's a computer that is out. That computer is being used to do some CAD programming because they're designing something. Over here, it's a lot more hands-on. You could tell it's something around design, right? This group is working on that design. You see some computers here in the back. It might be hard for you to see in the corner, but those students are researching, and they're researching independently, and they're engaged, they're motivated, they know where to go and what questions to ask. And you see, these students over here who are also working independently. Now, the thing I wanted you to really notice is it's very hard to find the teacher. And if you look quite closely, here is the teacher over here, and the teacher is merely observing everything that is going on. Well, I'm going to pull back the curtains and tell you what was happening. In this classroom, these students were designing animal habitats for pets in neighboring classrooms. And the simple question that guided that was, as responsible animal lovers, how do we create the best safe, healthy environments for our peers' pets? That was the question that drove it. And everything else that took place in this learner-centered environment was around answering that question. So we're going to look at what those three simple things are to create this kind of environment. And we're going to look at it through a couple of different experiences. Now, Maria Montessori, I think most of us are familiar with Maria Montessori, or you're familiar with Reggio Emilia. Her philosophy is the children are now working as if I did not exist. And as a scientific researcher, she created the kind of environments that would allow for that to happen. Okay, not all of us are working at Montessori schools, and Montessori teachers undergo around 2 years of preparation to create these kind of environments. I'm not saying it's going to happen overnight, but I will give you the structures that will allow you to start creating these environments and start thinking about how you're going to let students take center charge. Because what we need to do, as was already mentioned earlier, is we need to move from a teacher to a facilitator of learning experiences. And how do we do that? We need to become a flipped teacher. So we have heard this model of flipped teaching and learning. I'm going to take this other route and say we should also flip what our role is. And instead of us being the teacher, we're the facilitator. Our students are teaching each other. And we're going to look at how to do this in an actual learning experience that took place with 11 and 12-year-old students. Now, I want to start, before I start sharing this learning experience, in mentioning that we know students come in all shapes and sizes. And as we're looking at this learning experience, I want you to consider the learners that you have in your classroom. How might an experience that I'm going to introduce to you fit with our circles, our squares, our triangles, so that there's a place for every student to integrate within this and have their talents, their interests, and their learning styles highlighted. Okay, because that's what we're going to want to shift to. A teacher-centered environment usually is conducive for one style of learning. A learner-centered environment is conducive for all different styles. And if you want to look up some of the research that has been done, or really look up a school that is at the forefront of project-based experiences and creating the kind of environments that are going to allow students to thrive, I implore you to look up High Tech High in San Diego, which is my alma mater, which I got started in these learner-centered environments. This is the founder, co-founder of High Tech High. His name is Rob Reardon. So look up that school and look up the documentary Most Likely to Succeed. I think it will change how we think of teaching and learning and what can happen. So he helped me come up with these major shifts, all right? And we're going to share some of those in an actual experience. How do you create this learner-centered environment? Now, the experience that we're going to look at is called Food of the Future. And it's based around a real dilemma and a real problem. So one of the first things I'm going to implore everyone to do when you're thinking of setting up a learner-centered environment, think of a real problem, a real challenge that students are going to have to solve, that our world is going to have to solve. That is going to be one of the most important steps in creating these environments, because that provocation alone in solving this challenge is going to spring learners into action, as you see here. So when we go through this experience and share the different traits of that learner-centered environment, we want it to be built on the simple foundation of a real, meaningful task that students are undergoing. That is really what project-based learning is all about. It's not something that they're going to do in 2 days. It's something that's going to span over a longer period of time so that they can really go deep and not just shallow in answering it. So this particular experience was around food of the future. Now, the first step you're going to want to do in creating a learner-centered environment is you want to create a gap for learning. Our temptation as teachers is to have a textbook and have a chapter and have things we have to teach, whether it's math, whether it's science, whether it's language, whether it's art. And we want to teach students all of these things and then tell them, okay, we've taught you these things. Now we're going to do some kind of real hands-on kind of project. We want to flip that, and we want to start with creating a gap for learning, so that the way to fill it is through the actual content that we need to teach. And how do we create that gap? Well, we have to create a context, okay? here is the context that we created for Food of the Future. How do we get kids thinking like future scientists, botanists, and society members? Well, the way to do that is to create the context. How do you create the context? You give them an actual real experience that exposes them to what life would be like. We took these students out to the middle of a field that was near the school, and we evacuated them from the school, and we set up these tents, and we took down their names. We gave them a ration card for food and medical supplies, but we set up the scenario to say basically the society that we know has come to extinction, and we're going to have to recreate. So we created this gap for learning right away. We took them out of school. They're outside. They're imagining what it would be like to really have to rebuild. And that then opens up this gap for learning. And the big question that is going to drive the learning experience. As a new society, how will we feed and govern ourselves sustainably? Okay? So the very first thing when we think of our learner-centered environments is we want to start with a big inquiry, a big question that is meaty, that is meaningful, that is something that students really want to solve, and it creates then the gap for learning. So notice our students right here. The first question was posed to them. As a new society, how do we feed and govern ourselves? As facilitators of learning, we're not teachers anymore. We said, okay, you're back at school. Now we start our learning experience. And literally, this is how they started. If you see them, they're standing around. They look very confused. They don't know what to do. But we wanted to create that kind of context, right? Because we want them to be hungry for the learning they need to fill this gap. Now, I'm going to ask you, how might you fill that gap? What are the skills and content that students are going to need to know to answer this big question? As a new society, how will we feed and govern ourselves sustainably? Okay, so chat with the person next to you for 1 minute. What are students going to need to know, you think, and learn to answer this question? So chat with the person next to you, your elbow partner.
So so there is the big question. What are some of the knowledge and skills that students would need in order to answer this question? So this is what we are discussing, and this is the response that we... So Kyle, we have a few responses. Should we begin?
Okay, great, let's hear them.
There you go, ma'am.
Research. They need to research for that.
What kind of research?
Research skills, you mean?
Yes, research skills, like they can make an hypothesis, like a question is already there. They can do some sort of research and they can go out to bring a big picture in that.
Okay, so they have to establish a hypothesis around how they might feed themselves and do some research to be able to learn about that. Okay.
What I think that the students must know are what are their basic instincts, what does their body needs. That's a basic question, and they know that, and how to avoid deviance or you may say unacceptable behavior in the society, and how to respect each other's rights. That is very necessary for governing a productive society. So they know that how to respect each other, so they would start from that. Thank you.
Great, so they have to understand a little bit about rights and how you protect those rights, especially if they're going to be self-governing. Great. Okay, a couple more.
Any other dimension? We have one.
And one more.
I think they would, first of all, need to know how to grow food, what type of food, because they need to feed themselves. So they would look into basically growing food. Hi, Kyle. So yeah, that would be the first thing. How do we grow food? and what type of seasons and how do we grow foods in this season, what do we need right now. For the governing part, how do we look into making laws, who's in charge, so things like that. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. So thank you for sharing. Apologize if we didn't get to everybody.
So
You got it, right? They got to learn how to feed themselves. They have to learn how to research. They have to learn how to govern and how laws are written. And so if they have to do that, we know that there's this giant gap. Well, now we have an opportunity to fill that gap. Okay? So do you have the presentation on the screen? I can't see it.
Can we please have the presentation? And while we do that, can we just take one more response, Kyle?
Okay, let's take one more response.
Yes.
Okay, so as they need to have the knowledge of the needs, what are the needs to feed that? So first of all, the thinking skills, then they should have the problem solving skills, how they will manage all that. So managerial skills would be required, and so this is how one question will allow multiple skills to build on in that time. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So again, we have all this big gap, this knowledge and skills. Now, as the first gentleman mentioned, way back at the beginning of this presentation, he says, you've got to have structures and routines, right? So it's not chaotic. So we're not just going to give them a question and say, okay, you're loose for 6 weeks. Let's solve it, okay? But we do want to create a bit of that gap. We did create that gap, as I mentioned to you, from them, being confused. They needed to research to be able to come up with some answers. But one of the very first things to fill the gap is we asked them, it's winter season, and it was, and they realized they only had a few days actually to utilize, the growing space at the school. And so one of the very first activities, you remember that girl at the beginning, she said, we learn from activities. Well, the problem is so much of learning, we put activities after the learning. What if we flipped it and had activities first? One of the very first activities we tasked them with is saying, okay, quick, you've got tomorrow and you've got to be able to plant something. And we've got a field right outside and we've got a farmer who's going to help us out. How do we divide up this space? And we put the students immediately in their groups. They got all around this circle. They, as you see, started putting out their diagrams as to how they wanted to grow things. You got a couple of students on computers really quickly looking up, like, what's the best plants to grow during this season. And 2 people took charge, you see right here. Those 2 people took charge, and then other people were like, why are you guys taking charge? Why are you the leaders? So immediately, they see governance right away. They see the need for having governance and having some kind of system when it comes to making decisions. And finally, they went through, this whole governing process. That was one of the first activities we introduced them to. But of course, we really want them to go deep in this experience. So we've created the gap. Now, what do we do as facilitators of learning to fill it? How do we set up our learning environment? Well, one of the first things we do is we ask them to inquire, what do they need to know to be able to answer this big question? And so they're starting with all their kind of questions. How much space is needed for each crop? Which crop is going to grow the fastest? How will we fertilize? All these kind of questions. And then we're trying to find out, okay, which students have some of this knowledge, or where are we going to go to get this information? And that is then how you set up this learner-centered environment. They're going to need a few things. They're going to need help from their peers who know these answers. They're going to need help from resources to be able to research and answer these. And they're going to need help from the community and experts besides just ourselves as a teacher. So, here is, one of the first things that students are doing in this inquiry process is, they're accessing resources, they're coming up with diagrams, and they start teaching each other. Some of our students are very visual. They are going to be the ones who might be drawing out a picture of what this food production could look like. Some of our students are very much analytical, and they really want to understand all of the possible ways to answer this question. And so we immediately then give students this task, and they're filling this with, their learning. One of the things also that they're going to do, as you see here, is they're going to learn, from experts. Who are the people who might be able to answer this question, who are doing this outside of school? These were a couple of people we brought in who had been traveling around, and we're exposing people to the benefits of different growing methods and looking at things to grow that are more organic, because we know that's important for our wellness and health. And so these are students, chatting with them. As you see here as well, here are students then forming a committee. So here's a student committee as part of the class, and they start forming their own committees for how to answer this question and how to potentially govern. And you see them asking questions here. Now, learner-led discussions, as the gentleman had mentioned earlier, there should be protocols and structures that you set up as a teacher. And once we've set up those protocols or structures, then we can allow students to lead their own discussions. One of the key takeaways, hopefully, that you get from this is that you have some resources that are already set up. If you know what the big gap for learning is going to be ahead of time, as a teacher or facilitator, we can have some of those resources available. So these were students who were looking at this book called Omnivore's Dilemma. There are 4 different ways of growing food according to Omnivore's Dilemma, and they exposed them to these 4 methods. One was industrial farming, one was hunting gathering, one was organic, and one was big organic. And students were then formulating their opinions as to what might be the best growing method. So they're looking into this, they're having to do the research. What might they propose when it comes to how to grow their food? Their discussions, as you see here, are structured. They're structured around these discussions. You see the learners here are talking to each other and sharing their ideas. These people in the back are taking notes on the discussion, and they're observing the people in the discussion, because they are then going to give feedback to their peers on the discussion that they had. So notice how we are setting up the structures. We're also setting up the room and the environment to allow for these learners to take charge, and we are then just kind of invisibly guiding in the background. Now the question might be, well, where is the teacher? I took these pictures, I'm right behind them, so the teacher is always there, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to slowly remove the need for us to be there as our students are discovering these answers themselves. When it comes to debates or building literacy, we know the importance of students being able to formulate their arguments and learn about argumentative reasoning. So here are students, learning about the different policies for, argumentative debates and formulating argumentative evidence and justification for defending their point of view, and they're holding these debates. Okay, so as teachers, what we're doing is we're helping them with the process. We're creating some of these structures and protocols. We're mapping things out in terms of timeline, but beyond that, we're just really kind of taking a back seat and letting the learning experience unfold. Now, another one of these things we're going to think about is student work. Okay, so again, I told you this is going to be a very simple structure. We have a question that's going to start this whole learning experience. We want to fill that gap. We are still filling the gap, but then how are students filling that gap? What are they producing? And the kind of student work that you're going to get is going to be a very high quality, because students are going to be completing multiple drafts of their work. This is a student here who is coming up with her own method of food production that starts with riding a bicycle that's going to create energy. That energy is then going to get transferred, and as you see here, she's building out her food production system, and they're actually building the food production system as well. This person here is an expert on hydroponics, and as you see, there are different plants, seeds here, and she's teaching them, how to use this hydroponic aquaponic method. You might also see over here, and it might be hard for you guys to see, but there's a nice binder full of resources to support students. So that's something to consider too, is how are we supporting students in this learning experience. Is we have kind of a nice roadmap that we've laid out with them with the journal that helps support them as well. So hopefully this is getting you thinking, okay, what kind of meaningful question can we ask our learners? What kind of resources can we provide to them to help support them in answering that question? And then how are we going to have them showcase what they've produced? So again, with student work, they're going deeper. Someone mentioned as well that students are going to take on different roles. As you see here, some of the students are involved with setting up the hydroponic system. Some of the students are involved in researching a little bit more about it. And so everybody seems to have a role. And of course, when that comes together, it's magical work. And what students are doing is they're actually producing products that are meaningful. Yeah, and here's another picture as well, where you see the students who are chatting about their particular designs. And what's great is we talked about Gen Z and Gen Z at the beginning. They want to be expressive, they want to be collaborative, they want to have hands-on activities. And this is the perfect example of that. You see these students who are collaborating, it's hands-on, they're actually having to build these things themselves, and they have an opportunity to be expressive because they're coming up with different ways to answer this question. Now, another thing you might set up in this learner-centered environment is who's going to look at the student work. Is it going to be you as the teacher, because then everything is going to be teacher-centered? Or is it going to be people who might be able to give students real feedback on their work to really raise the stakes of their work? Here is a panel of different experts who are able to give students feedback on their work. So that's something else to consider, is who's going to evaluate students' work. Now, another question might be, well, how do we assess their learning? How do we ensure that learning is actually taking place? And I'll tell you, a paper or pencil assessment is probably not the best way to assess what they've learned. The best way to assess what they've learned is think back to the very question that we asked. As a new society, how do you feed and govern yourselves? What were the skills that were necessary to answer that question? Those are the skills then that we are going to be assessing. And students along the way are going to be assessing each other's work. Okay, so when we set up that learner-centered environment, we want peers to be able to give feedback on their peers' work. Here's a gallery walk where students are looking at different designs that their classmates came up with and giving them feedback. We also look at an opportunity for students to use rubrics, right, which all of us are familiar with. What does high quality work look like when it comes to them producing their different products, and what kind of skills will they need? Well, here's when it comes to product design, what they're looking for, originality, value, and style. And now the students, the learners themselves, are assessing themselves against that rubric. So rather than them giving you the work and waiting for you to give them a grade, they're producing their work and they're looking at, okay, how can I assess myself? How well did my idea, was it new? Was it unique? Was it surprising? Did it break rules and conventions, or did it rely on existing models? And the great news about this is that you don't have to assess them just one time and give them a grade. You're trying to help them build their understanding so that when they're producing their products, they're getting good feedback so that by the end, they have something that really is meaningful and does answer the question. So again, here are students, creating their different products and evaluating against the rubric. Now, one of the things someone else mentioned is that you would see students presenting to each other. So this is students presenting their concept for government, and they're sharing how laws should be created and how rules should be created, which is what someone addressed earlier. They are presenting their ideas to other students, and other students, as the society, are going to give them feedback on what they like about that model and what potentially are going to be some challenges. So, again, as you see here, different groups are presenting and sharing their ideas. Every learner has a responsibility. Some of us think, if I set up a learner-centered environment, how do I ensure that all the learners are learning? Well, when you give them all real tasks and you have them in smaller groups, it's an easier way to ensure that each person, has a particular role and is learning. So these students were in very small groups of 3 or 4, and everybody had to present and share. So, we talked about presentation skills, research skills. The whole way through this, we're able to assess those skills. Finally, certainly last but not least, at the end of the learning experience, how are they going to present their learning? And here is the class presenting their solutions. So they had to all bring their ideas together, what kind of food production systems, what kind of governance they had, and then share that with the entire year group. And this was, a very big learning experience that everybody was undergoing in the year group. And think about the meaning that they got out of that. And think about how many times throughout all of those pictures you saw a teacher, okay? There are a lot of teachers, but I don't think you saw many adults other than the adults that we had who are the experts who are supporting students in their work. So that is what it looks like when you create a learning centered environment. Again, the three things that you want to do is you want to create a gap for learning with a really meaningful question. You want to fill that gap with the inquiries and the resources and the knowledge and skills that students are going to need to answer that question. And then you want to give students an opportunity to present those solutions. As I said, creating learner-centered environments is not difficult. In theory, the concept is there. And once you have those three things, the question, the gap, and the presentation, then you could set out a little bit of a roadmap depending on your age level of your learners. Now, I wanted to share, before it goes to your turn, because you guys are going to have a turn to take a shot at this, okay? As is the case, I think, with any learning, you didn't learn just from hearing me talk. You're learning by doing. So you're going to have a chance to plan out a learning experience in only 10 minutes, okay? But before we do that, I want to highlight a group that I've been working on with. And, you know, one of the persons, people who just spoke is part of that. Aisha is part of our group. But we're going through how to create these learning experiences, and I'll give you really a ringing endorsement for Beacon House. Beacon House is doing this. Classrooms are doing this. They're addressing the floods that happened in Pakistan and helping to support the flood victims and having kids come up with potential solutions. That's one of the projects. They're learning about growing and making gardens and making more green spaces. That's another one of the project-based experiences that they're introducing. Another one is they're learning more about the community and how they can help. So all of these teachers are going through this. And I tell you, it doesn't matter if you're in Pakistan or if you're in Hong Kong. If you have the structure or the framework, anyone can create these kind of experiences. So I wanted to highlight them. And with that said, I wanted to give you an opportunity for the next 10 minutes. That's all you're going to get is 10 minutes, okay? This is very rapid. Now this Padlet, I'll show you what it looks like, okay? This is the Padlet, and I will put it up on the screen. There are different learning experiences, okay? Here's a lower primary experience. It's Green Campus. The question is, how can greenifying our campus help us live healthier lives? The task for those people who teach that age group are to look at this question and consider what are the skills that students need to know to be able to answer that question. Where it says comment here, okay, because everybody can contribute to this if you have your computers, is you might say something like, have to learn about different growing seasons, okay? And that might be something that you comment on. The next thing is, well, how are you going to empower Generation Z to teach and learn these skills? So how are you going to move from just saying, okay, I'm going to lecture from the front of the classroom? What kind of activities might you lead to have them learn about different growing seasons where you're not at the front of the classroom? That would be the next step, okay? So you might say, take them on a field trip to a local farm, okay? That might be something that you do, right? Because you're taking on a field trip, you're allowing that learning experience to teach them. Now, if you're upper primary, your question is around mock election. And the whole project is around students using the election process to come up with their own government. How can we use electoral process to create an effective student government? So these are the green things that you're filling out. What are the need to know skills? How will Generation Z teach and learn them? If you're lower secondary, you're looking at the business project, and students are going to take on their own small businesses. How do they do that? And what skills do they need to know? And the upper secondary is the podcast project. There's a sample here with the one I just shared with you. What were the need to know skills and how will they learn those? So I shared that just to give you a model to go off of. So each group is going to be in one of these. So consider, what kind of learners do you work with? Is it lower primary, upper primary, lower secondary, upper secondary? And then you're going to take the opportunity to start thinking about these things. If you can't access this because you don't have a computer or you don't have an iPad, you can just discuss this with the person next to you, okay? Conwall, is there any
Yes.
other clarification?
Yes, so
Yeah.
Kyle, can we please have the QR code on screen?
Okay, here is the QR code.
Okay, so we are left, for the workshop, we are only left with 18 minutes, out of which, of course, the 10 minutes will be spent in working on this Padlet. Now, if you could scan the code visible on the screen, and there are some QR codes already available for you on the sidebars, and then the Padlet should open, and if you are a lower primary teacher, you will fill that bit. If you're an upper primary teacher, so there are different tabs made for all of you. So if you could quickly do that, because we are running short on time and we want to end this workshop. Yes. We have a question, Kyle, while everyone's working.
Kyle, can you tell me what is the time frame that this exercise took? Was it a week, a month, a term, a year? What was the time frame?
So, good question. So typically what I like to say is have 4 or 5 of these experiences throughout the year. So it's a unit. So think of it as a unit of study. So usually our units of study are going to last for around 5 weeks, 5 to 6 weeks. So this particular one was a 6-week learning experience, and they were given about half the day, and they were learning the different subjects. So they still went to their subject classes, but they were learning the content related to the learning experience. So about 6 weeks.
Thank you.
Yep.
So can we have the QR code on the screen? So right now, the QR code for Padlet is what we are going to work on.
Yep, great. So I see some people are in it. Again, you just would comment here. What do they need to know skills? How will they teach and learn these? So just find your age group.
So there's internet available for those who are struggling by the name of SOT guest. You could connect to that.
And Conwall, do you want me to have them scan maybe the QR code that's on the wall, and I can just put this up there so they can at least start having the discussion?
Yes, that's great. You can do that.
Okay. So you guys can at least have your discussion. If you can't get on the tech, you guys can discuss with your partners. Pick one of these. Talk about what they need to know skills, and how will they teach and learn those. Okay. Great. So we see people filling that out. Again, you're filling out the green. The thing in green is what you fill out.
Kyle, do we have some responses? If you could please start that, because we are only left with, 10 minutes?
Yeah, you mean the Q&A?
Let's start discussing the responses.
Okay. Great. So I see it's been, the Padlet has been updated. Do you want to take people's responses with the mic, or do you want me to just kind of look at these and discuss them?
You could start discussing what's on the screen.
Okay, great. So notice we have, looking at the lower primary green campus experience, we have some people who are filling things in. They talked about different types of plants and their benefits. They'll need to learn how to grow, where to grow, how to take care of their plants, how to overcome possible factors. So, this was an actual experience that year 1 students took on. I witnessed this experience, and they turned their classroom and the area right outside the classroom into a growing space, and the kids were learning about different plants and different plant growth. Each kid had a different plant they were responsible for in a different kind of pot, and they were taking observations. So this happened in a year 1 classroom. So great. Someone's mentioned how will they teach and learn these skills? Communication and discussions around research. Okay, purpose-built classes, that can be very helpful. Exactly, right? So I was just mentioning to us, how do we set up our environment that is going to allow for this learning experience to thrive? And we might even have, different parts of our classroom that are set up with different lighting fixtures to be able to look at how lights, affect plants. We might have microscopes that are set up in our classroom so they can, take some of these plants under the microscopes, take some of the leaves under the microscopes as well. So I like that this person has said purpose-built class. Invite farmers to talk about their experiences. Setting up a botanical garden, excellent, right? So we can do things to our environment that is going to allow these to thrive. So excellent work with this one. Upper primary mock election experience. So some people are on to these, not a lot of input. They have to know their roles and responsibilities. Good. Like what is your role as a citizen? What's the individual role? Can anyone make a difference? So again, some people are starting this. This is a year 5 experience. Now someone asked me as a question, they said, can you run this in a traditional subject? What does this look like? And my answer is yes, because this was a government class. And instead of teaching them all about government, they had the students participate in the actual electoral process. And by doing that, they taught government through that. And the learners really impressed the teacher with the speeches that they came up with, the creative ideas, and how to improve the school. And so yes, this can be done in a very traditional subject. It doesn't have to be done across subjects. Let's look at this one, business experience. How can we use principles of entrepreneurship to meet a community need? Someone mentioned assessing the product that is the need for the community. Excellent. So what is a community need? They have to look at that. What is a product to help? Look at what the problems are. Solve for individual, government, and economy. I watched this learning experience where students worked with actual NGOs which were involved in different causes, non-governmental organizations, and they supported their businesses in helping their business get their information out to more people and learn, well, how can we create more awareness around these different issues? So I like that this person's thinking about problems that are happening to be able to solve. And here's some of the knowledge and skills they're talking about. How might they teach it? Teachers' guidance, videos of prominent entrepreneurs, excellent. Field trips, success stories, excellent. I watched another year 5 class develop food trucks for the community, and they started out in the same way this person mentioned. They had success stories from local food truck owners who came in and shared their stories of how they started their first concept of their business and restaurant and how it evolved. Okay, let's look at this last one, the upper secondary podcast experience, podcast project. How as storytellers can we use a podcast to share stories of hope? Students can share their experiences. It's very common these days. Language skills need to be relevant, right? Let's think of production skills, speaking and listening, editing skills, research skills here, keen observation, human attitudes, how podcasts work, good. How to create a logical and coherent argument. And how will they learn them? Telling real life stories. So this project, the students actually went around and interviewed their own family and their own community members to find out about their stories, because the American dream, which is where this took place, only had the stories of just the very successful and wealthy people. They wanted to change that narrative, and so they did that by creating this podcast. So in addition to letting the learners, take control here, we're actually helping them do something that's really meaningful in the world. So excellent contributions, I would say, Conwal. Conwal, I see a couple questions that have been written. Do you want me to address those?
Yes. So we have 7 more minutes left, Kyle. Maybe we can take a few questions from the audience here. Now for you or everyone, if you keep this QR code, you can take a photo of that, which means you will have access to this Padlet forever. And then you can keep an eye on it or keep adding on or use something in your classroom with your students as well. So any questions? Yes, so far before we wrap up, let's take a few questions.
Kyle, we do have 2 questions sent to you already. So while Kyle answers those, maybe others can think of more questions, and please tell them to me or Ms. Kamal.
Okay, so I'll take these first ones. I have 2 questions. One question is, can we get an example of a traditionally taught subject which can now be taught using the student-centered approach, like a mathematical problem or something similar? Okay, sure. So there were students that were learning about physics and different kind of formulas that were related to physics. So this is a physics course, and it was, I think, upper secondary. And instead of just teaching the physics formulas and everything else, they had them build Rube Goldberg machines, and they learn about forces of motion. Now, Rube Goldberg's machines are these very complex machines that perform a very simple task. So imagine, all these levers, engineering going, this lever's going back, up, and down, and there's a ball that's going through this whole thing, and eventually it goes and does one simple task. And this particular Rube Goldberg machine that they built had a simple task of then turning off a light switch. So they're learning about engineering and physics principles. So mathematics, they're learning all those different kind of formulas of forces and motion and energy through this experience. So hopefully that's an example that resonates with you. The second question is it really necessary to give syllabus to the students? Can't we give them an open source learning center or classroom? I would say if you feel confident of having an open source learning center or classroom, your classroom can be your syllabus. So I say that's a great question. No, you do not need to give them a syllabus, because a syllabus is usually teacher-centered and it's 10, 15 pages long. Here's all the things you do. I would give students, though, a simple handout that is 2 pages long. It says, here's the big question we're going to answer. Here's a simple timeline of how we're going to set up the learning experience. And here is how when you're going to present it. What that'll do is it's going to create excitement for students, and it's not going to have too much stuff that a syllabus would. And then you make your open source classroom a place where they can access the resources to be able to do that. But if you don't give them anything, sometimes it could get a little bit messy and chaotic. So that's my answer to that one.
Do we have any other questions? All right, I think Kyle explained it so well that a lot of things are already clear. If we don't have any more questions, Kyle, yes, please continue.
Okay, sure, yeah, I just want to share one or two things as a resource that's going to support you if there's no questions. So are there no questions?
No, not at the moment, I guess. Everyone's listening. All
right. Sorry, I'm not there with you, so I just have to guess how everybody is feeling. But I'm hoping people are feeling, excited about what this might mean for their classroom. So, I wanted to give you a resource that might be helpful. Okay. So let me share the screen really quickly with you, and it's going to be a resource that's going to support everyone, hopefully. So I've created a little bit of a framework that kind of supports us in setting up learner-centered environments. And as I mentioned, that group that I'm working with right now at Beacon House is going through this framework, and they're applying that to their learning experiences. And so the framework is just around the 12 shifts. So I introduced you to kind of how to set up these experiences, and now how do you really make good on that and follow through with that. So these are the 12 shifts for learner-centered experiences. If you want to take a photo of this, you can, but there's also a resource that I'm going to give you so that you can identify how you're doing as an educator, okay? So how to dive deeper, again, as I mentioned, lots of people are using these. There's a group in Beacon House that's using this. I work over here in Hong Kong, and this is a school in Thailand that is also using these 12 shifts. And I have another school in Taiwan that is using the 12 shifts as well. And I hope it really helps support you in thinking about how to improve your environment to make it more learner-centered. Here is that resource, okay? So if you scan this QR code, it's going to take you to a place where you can get quick access to the scorecard. So I'll put that up there and I'll show you what it leads to.
And the bigger QR code you see on the walls, the one we did not scan, leads to this same infographic. So you can scan it from the walls as well.
Excellent. So it's going to take you, thank you for doing that. It's going to take you to this scorecard here. Okay. And yeah, here it comes. So here's a scorecard. You just fill out your email address. And then once you do that, it's going to ask you some questions about each shift. Okay, so you say next, and then it says learning design. Do I include student input in my learning design? Sometimes, often, so you might say sometimes. Okay, next question. process. So it's going to take you through those 12 shifts. And once you've done that, I'm going to, it'll send you some resources and some support for some things that are going to help you to make that shift. So I hope that you take the opportunity to do that. Again, it's the other QR code that is on the wall. And I'd love to, be able to support you if I can in any way possible. And I'm finally now going to end with a story, because I always like to end with a story. You might be wondering what happened at the end of this learning experience besides just a presentation. Was that it? The answer is no, there was more than just the presentation. What they ended with was a gigantic feast. So a lot of this, the herbs and everything else that they grew, they used to flavor and make this really nice feast. All the kids prepared a different part of that from what they grew as a society. But more importantly is the transformation that happened in the community. This farmer that helped them plant their crops is now an integral part of our school, and we partner with him on lots of different learning experiences. And now our school is not separated from the community. Our school feels like it's a part of the community. So I wanted to end with that story to say that it's transformative for more than just you as a teacher and your students. It's transformative for the community as well. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be able to speak. And again, here is my information if you want to reach out to me.
Thank you so much, Kyle. We've ended right on time. On behalf of Beacon House, I would like to thank Mr. Kyle Wagner and our gracious participants of this workshop for attending SOT Edition 15. The feedback form for this workshop will be emailed to you, so please make sure that you fill it out so that we can improve the workshops and their settings further. Also, before you leave, please do visit the immersive arts exhibitions, which have been designated in different rooms across the venue. Also, I'd like to thank our lead sponsor, UBL, as well as other sponsors, without whose support this event would not have been possible. Thank you so much, everybody, and best of luck for the next session.
We know it was a bit warm here, but we really loved your attention and enthusiasm. Thank you so much.